Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first community meeting for the Bus Network Redesign project. My name is Reagan Checchio, and I will be serving as the moderator for tonight's meeting. I would like to remind everyone of the rules for the meeting and for participating in this meeting, as well as remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded. It is also being streamed on the Boston Neighborhood Network. While we wish we were able to do this meeting in person, we are hoping that we have designed an online public meeting that will be interactive and provide an opportunity for us to have a conversation together. Before we can begin that conversation, I do want to review a few technical aspects of the Zoom platform. Next slide. We have an interpreter who is translating the meeting tonight into Spanish. If you require this service, please click the interpretation button on your screen. It's the globe icon, and select which language you wish to hear. At this moment, I will ask all English speakers to please select English as their chosen language. This will allow you to hear translated non-English comments during the Q&A. Next slide. You can view closed captions by clicking the closed captions feature and selecting from the options shown. Show subtitle will display a caption at the bottom of the screen. View full transcript will display the meeting's audio transcription in a window to the right. Next slide. All attendees are muted and will have their video off during the presentation just to prevent excessive background noise. If you are viewing this meeting on a computer, you can toggle to speaker view to see the presentation more prominently. If you are on a smartphone, swipe to change the view. Next slide. You may also use the chat button to submit a typed question or comment at any point during the meeting. We will be monitoring the chat during the presentation, but ask that you hold substantive comments and questions for the breakout session discussions that we will be having later in the meeting. If you have a technical problem, please share your issue in the chat feature at any point during the meeting, and we will respond as quickly as possible. I'll note that all project staff members are listed with project team or MBTA or MassDOT next to their names in the participant list tonight. A reminder to everyone that the chat is visible to everyone, and we encourage you to keep any comments in the chat respectful to other attendees. And now I am pleased to introduce Caroline Finesse from MassDOT, who will provide more detail about Bus Network Redesign. Caroline?
Thanks, Reagan. Good evening, everyone. I am Caroline Finesse, the project manager for the Bus Network Redesign. I'm really excited to be here today along with my colleagues who will help me present. So I'm just going to introduce them. Sheena, if you could go to the next slide, actually, with the agenda. Thank you. So first is Melissa DeLay, the Senior Director of Service Planning. Lissa Zimmer, who is the lead data and analytics for Bus Network Redesign in the Office of Performance Management and Innovation. And lastly, Christoph Spieler, who is an advisor to the Bus Network Redesign and a leader in Houston's Bus Network Redesign. I would also like to thank the elected officials who have joined us for this meeting tonight. And actually, if you all could identify yourselves in the chat, that would be very helpful for when we get to the Q&A portion of this meeting tonight. So before we start the presentation, just wanted to walk folks through our agenda for tonight. So just went through introductions. We then have a presentation. We have planned some breakout sessions so that we can have smaller group discussions. We're really excited to see a good turnout tonight, but we think having these smaller breakout rooms will be helpful to dive in a little bit more. And then we will come back to the main virtual room for a Q&A and a wrap up. Before we get started, I would like to do a quick Zoom poll. So Amanda, if you wouldn't mind dropping in that Zoom poll for folks, and just ask which of kind of the following responses describes your interest in this meeting. And you can select multiple, by the way. So I'll just wait to see this populated. I see a bunch of folks putting in their answers. Oh, it keeps moving around. So fun. Okay, I'll wait until we get to like 75%. We're almost there. Okay. Great. So it looks like we have like a really big mix of folks. Majority live in the MBTA service area. That makes a lot of sense considering you're coming to a bus network redesign meeting. And then, looks like folks work in the area, are bus riders, advocates, and excited to see we have some elected officials here tonight as well. So I'm now going to switch to our presentation. So it's a really exciting and important moment to decide kind of the future of bus in Greater Boston right now. And if you can go to the next slide, Shayna. At the MBTA, we're actively working on ways to make improvements to the bus experience through the Better Bus Project. And the Better Bus Project really just represents a number of different initiatives, like I said, that aim to improve the bus experience for our riders. And these initiatives include bus transit priority to really get our buses out of traffic, service changes like bus network redesign and the 2019 route changes, improvements to our bus stops, bus modernization, including fleet and facilities, improved passenger information, and bus operations. And we see service and the redesign as a large part of building a better bus network, but I do want to emphasize that to benefit the most riders, we're really coordinating across these initiatives. And in order to really do this effectively and improve the network, it's really a team effort that goes even beyond the projects here. There are so many different projects, teams, municipalities, and other stakeholders who are interrelated into improving the network, many of which are in the virtual room tonight, which is great. Next slide. So what is the bus network redesign? The bus network redesign is an opportunity to really completely reimagine how the bus network can better reflect the travel needs of the region and create a better experience for current and future riders. Next slide. So why are we doing this project? Greater Boston has experienced significant changes in recent years while the bus network has stayed largely the same. And we have experienced probably the greatest amount of change in the past year. Next slide. New employment districts have emerged, demographics have shifted, congestion has increased, and travel patterns have changed. Next slide. There are also more people and more cars. Boston's population has increased. Households owning vehicles have increased. And we also see that congestion has increased. This is a statistic from 2019 that the average trip during bus trip during peak hours took 20% longer in 2019 than it did in 2006. But we know that congestion, unfortunately, has returned. Next slide. And the bus network doesn't look so different from a 1920s streetcar map. Next slide. But riders tell us that the network does not work for them. Next slide. In the Better Bus Project, riders said the bus network is infrequent, unreliable, slow, indirect, and overly focused on peak service. And these are all factors that would really improve the overall bus experience. So now I'm going to pass it off to Christoph.
Next slide. So bus network redesign is a once-in-a-generation attempt to transform the network for the people who depend on it. Next slide. We know that Boston needs better bus service, and we also know that there's lots of ways to make the bus service better. Caroline talked through some of the different ways the MBTA is working on bus service right now. Next slide. For example, we can look at bus lanes. We can make service faster and more reliable by putting it in bus lanes. Next slide. And we also have the opportunity to improve individual routes. We could add frequency or straighten out individual routes. And we've done some of that. Next slide. But there are limitations to what that can accomplish, because anything that starts with the current network builds in the basic structure of the current network. It takes for granted that structure that we inherited from those old streetcar routes. And this bus network redesign is a chance to re-examine that structure, to say the city has changed, how does the structure of the bus network change around it? And there are huge opportunities we have with a redesign. Next slide. Here you can see what we pulled off in Houston. Red routes here are routes that run every 15 minutes or better all day, 7 days a week. So you could see what Houston was able to do with the same level of resources to dramatically improve frequent service. But you can also see a real shift in the structure, a system that has a lot more crosstown routes, which makes it easier for people who aren't headed downtown. That's what a network redesign can do. But we can think about what specifically, how can we change a network within a network redesign? So let's think through some of those kind of changes. Next slide. A network redesign can be used to focus service. We can use it to put more buses, more resources in the places where the demand is highest, in the places where the most people are riding today. Next slide. It can also focus service into corridors that sometimes it may make a whole lot more sense to say you might have to walk a little bit further, but when you do, you will get much better bus service. We can put more routes on the major streets where, again, they benefit the most people. Next slide. A bus network redesign can connect more riders to rapid transit, allow more people to take advantage of the faster and more reliable service that rail offers. Next slide. A network redesign can also increase frequency on the streets we have bus service today. We've got a lot of streets in Boston that have multiple routes, all of which are infrequent. We can simplify a network so that street may have only one route on it, but that route offers much more frequent, much more reliable, much more dependable service. Next slide. A network redesign can also be the chance to introduce new services. There may be some places where something like an on-demand shuttle might be a better solution than a fixed route bus service. There may be some places which need local circulators rather than typical fixed routes. So there's a chance to do that in places where that makes sense. Next slide. A network redesign can also do more than a route by route change can to straighten out routes. Straighter routes are more reliable, they're faster, they get people where they're going. But sometimes the best way to do that is adjust all of the routes together. So you might have one frequent route on the main street that goes straight and a different route that picks up the smaller destinations around it. Next slide. A network redesign can also make trips more direct by changing where people connect, by making you not have to go as far out of your way in order to connect to a different bus service. Next slide. And I think this is incredibly important, a network redesign can make an entire system more legible. A network redesign is a way to make a system easier to understand, which is really important for first-time riders, but it's also really important for people who depend on the bus for all of their trips, who may be making different trips over the course of the day. Making a network easier to navigate makes it better for the people who use it. Next slide. This matters because bus matters. Pre-pandemic, the MBTA bus network served nearly 450,000 trips on a typical weekday. That's more than a third of all of MBTA trips. Next slide. And even during the pandemic, we've seen the importance of that network. Many MBTA bus riders are lower income, people of color, seniors, or people who live in households with no vehicles. And during the pandemic, we saw bus retained up to 4 times more of its riders than commuter rail or ferry. Bus is carrying those essential workers who keep our city running. Next slide. And this project is the opportunity to make a network that is better for all of the people who are riding it today, as well as people who will need it in the future. But how do we do that? And with that, I'll turn this over to Alyssa to talk about how we approach this project. Next slide.
Great. Next slide. Yeah, as Christoph said, bus has been critical during the pandemic. And sort of looking towards the future, we're interested in not just restoring service to what we saw on the streets pre-COVID, because we know that network wasn't good enough for the riders. We want to transform service significantly to make sure that any network sort of coming out of this process is better, providing better service to folks, and is more equitable. And we also know that better transit is critical to the economic recovery coming out of the pandemic. And so we're really keeping that in mind as we're figuring out how to connect people to the places that matter to them. This redesign is based entirely on sort of pre-COVID service hours, thinking about sort of what resources we have available to us as an agency, but we're also making sure that the process is also going to show us where we can add more service and where we can improve existing service when we have resources available to us. And all of these things kind of come together to lead to a network that we want to make sure actually changes to reflect the travel needs of the region and doing what it takes to make that happen. Next slide. And again, as Christoph had mentioned, we're talking about a blank slate redesign here, where we really start from scratch and think about how do we provide service that best matches the sort of demand in the area and people's needs, particularly riders' needs. So we're making sure that this redesign is data-driven, but that all of the data that we use is confirmed with outreach and with stakeholder engagement. So on top of new stakeholder engagement that we're working on starting with this public meeting, we're also using everything we've heard from you and our riders since the Better Bus Project. We know that riders want more frequent service. We know that riders want more reliable service. And we know that riders want a sort of simpler network that's better matched to their travel needs. And to help us figure out whether we're doing that, we're using travel data that can help us capture trips people are making in the region so that we can really understand sort of the travel needs in our region. Next slide. And when we talk about using travel data to work on this redesign, what we're talking about is something called location-based services, or LBS data, which describes trips made on all modes in the MBTA service area. So we're not just talking about transit trips, but we're looking at where people are driving, where people are biking, where people are walking. And this data that we're using captures and is representative of all trip types. So our network right now is pretty peak focused, really thinking about sort of matching commute trips. And moving forward, we really want to think about how can we plan to all sorts of trips that happen, including more recreational trips, middle of the day trips, commute trips that are during sort of non-traditional 9 to 5 hours, and all of those sorts of changes. And this data specifically comes from anonymous cell phone location data, which is completely unlinked from anyone's cell phone numbers or any information about individuals to make sure that we're preserving privacy. But this information does allow us to do some amount of inferring about which trips are being made by low-income people, people of color, and people in zero or low vehicle households, so that we can make sure we're planning adequately for equity. And really, this data allows us to identify the places that we don't currently serve, but that have high travel demand, where if we only looked at data, ridership data for our system, we'd miss completely new places that we could and should be serving. Next slide. And this data will be used to help inform some of the design processes for the bus network redesign, but it's also going to help us measure success. So most importantly, we want to make sure that any network that comes out of this process is improving the experience of our riders and better matching travel needs. And we're going to know if we did that by answering these 3 really critical questions. The first is around equity. Is the T providing transit critical populations with equitable transit service? And when we talk about transit critical populations, we're talking about low income people, people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, and people who live in households with few or no vehicles. And we really want to make sure that sort of this trip making is centered in all of our decision making throughout this process. Second, we want to make sure that the T is connecting people to the places that are most important to them, what we're calling access. So not just do we have service somewhere, but do we have service that actually gets you where you want to go? And on top of that, we want to make sure that we're not just providing any service to get you where you want to go, but that the T is actually a good choice for making these trips, meaning that we're providing you with high quality service, something that we're calling competitiveness. Next slide. And defining high quality trips can be difficult, but really what we're thinking about throughout this process is quality and competitiveness relative to driving. And we're looking specifically at things like walk distance, transfers, travel time, and frequency as parts of the bus experience that are changeable through a redesign. And there's lots of other things that matter to people. For example, we know that reliability really matters to people. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that later and how our transit priority team is working on We know that stop amenities really matter to people. So we also want to make sure we talk a little bit about what's happening there throughout the rest of the agency. And next slide. So finally, sort of all of these ways we want to measure success require very specific definitions. So I mentioned places that are important to our riders. I mentioned sort of definitions of really good, high quality service. And we want to make sure we're not just using our definition of those words. And so we're doing a pretty big survey engagement effort to make sure that when we're talking about places and we're talking about what makes transit high quality, we're using specific input from riders and from the public. So we'll be launching a survey tool that asks you about sort of local destinations, thinking about travel in your neighborhood, about regional destinations, like really big important places for the sort of greater Boston area, like maybe Logan Airport. And we're also going to be asking you questions around specific trips and what about transit makes it high quality, so that we can both sort of inform the design of our network and also particularly really be able to say, like, here's how, like, whether or not we've been able to sort of meet the standards of our riders as a part of the Bus Network redesign. And this tool is going to be launched on our website next week. And we'll be sending out information about that when it gets launched, but it'll be available in English, Spanish, Chinese, and Portuguese, and will also be fully accessible. And with that, I will pass things off to Melissa to talk a little bit more about the actual design process and implementation.
Thanks, Alyssa. Next slide, please. So I'd like to set the stage for what you can expect to come from the Bus Network redesign. Next slide, please. You can expect that many of the MBTA's bus routes will change, but neighborhoods that have service today will still have service, and today's heavily traveled corridors will still be important routes. Next slide. A network that's simpler and easier to understand. Next slide. You can expect more high-frequency corridors. When we survey our riders, one of the most important ways that we hear we can improve rider experience is by making more high-frequency corridors where people access service just as they do the rapid transit network without needing to consult a schedule. Next slide, please. You can expect better connections to local and regional destinations. In our work, we hear, for example, that the Longwood medical area and other important local and regional destinations are just not well served by the current network. Next slide. You can expect a focus on all-day service with more buses in the midday, evening, and weekends. This is something you might see a slight softening of some of our very commuter-oriented peak services, but filling in those gaps in the midday and evenings where often today's frequencies are just not very high. Next slide. So this isn't a long-range plan. We want to have a better network on the street starting next year. So next slide. To that end, we have an implementation timeline shown here. Right now, we are in the planning stage, calendar year 2021, where we're reviewing draft networks. We'll have more to share on that later this fall. And hopefully in 2022, we'll be able to adopt that final network and commit to full implementation. But you'll see that implementation is spread out over a multi-year period. I expect that there'd be first phases of implementation starting next fall, so of 2022. That would be for the sort of lead changes for anything that can be done with existing operators, existing bus count, existing accessible bus stops. So if it's a matter of updating signage and making new schedules, there might need to be some phasing by geographic area, since it takes a certain amount of time to do these things. So those early changes might be spread out over perhaps 2 or 3 scheduled periods. But then in the subsequent years, anything that would require additional buses or additional operators, or construction of new stops if we're serving new areas, or construction of other priority treatments in order to unlock service into some of the important congested areas. Those are things that would follow in subsequent years. Next slide, please. So I want to emphasize that municipal partnerships are key to success, and those partnerships can take a number of different forms. For one, to increase service in congested corridors, we need effective transit priority. Certainly, we don't want to throw good resources after bad and just have more buses that are getting stuck in traffic and not really meeting that demand. We need to have, whether it's bus lanes if possible, or queue jumps, or transit signal priority, or whatever transit priority treatments can be effective and help us move buses more quickly, because that's how we can serve more people better with any fixed number of buses and operators. But increased service will also require new and expanded layover locations. Those are very important. That would be the places, at the ends of the lines where there might be 5 minutes between trips. Just when we're running a service, it's important that we have these places to recover our time, for operators to use the restroom. This is kind of an important part of being able to provide the service. So this is another way that we can cooperate with municipalities to make a successful new bus network. We'll need accessible bus stops and bus shelters in new locations, and we'll need new and upgraded garages to operate this service. The bus network doesn't run without the buses, so we need to maintain the system in a state of good repair. So the MBTA would only increase service in congested corridors where partnerships of this variety of ways with municipalities and other roadway owners result in the infrastructure to provide that service. Next slide, please. And I'll end with this slide for my section. The redesign is coordinated with other initiatives to maximize benefit to riders. So here we're looking at the bus network redesign. We're looking at how can we change the routes to make sure that we can get people to where they need to go, that we have the appropriate frequency, and that the network is legible and easy to understand. But this works in concert with our fleet and facilities plan. That's looking at replacing garages, replacing our fleet. It's also doing things like looking at electrification of the bus fleet. So this is another piece of our three-legged stool that is defining a better rider experience. And then lastly, a very important piece that works in concert with all of these is bus priority. That's, again, as I was mentioning, what can we do to keep transit moving through traffic, whether it's through bus lanes, queue jumps, or transit signal priority. So with that, I will turn it back to Caroline.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So next slide. So what will you see and what's next? Next slide. So this is just kind of a big picture overview of where we've been and where we're going. For the past year and a half, we've really been focused on understanding how travel in the region has changed, and it's changed a lot. Especially in this past year. We've also spent a lot of time internally working on what our service design principles and our metrics should be. And at the same time, we got a ton of feedback in 2019 through the Better Bus Project from our riders. And we did a lot of research during that time as well. So we've been spending time examining all of the input that we heard from that process. Now we're at the point where we have kind of working definitions of our metrics, as Alyssa talked about, that really kind of define success for this project. And we're about to begin this kind of first phase of outreach, of really understanding where do people need to go and what makes transit a good option to get them there. In the late fall, early winter, we're going to have a draft network map that we will be doing a lot of extensive engagement to really hear from people, what they think about the map, if we missed anything. And then we'll be going through that extensive engagement, reviewing that input in order to essentially propose a new network and bring that to our board for adoption. Then there will be another round of outreach going kind of from planning to implementation in another review of that final map. And we are planning for, as Melissa talked about, implementation for a rolled implementation starting in 2022. Next slide. So I just want to wrap up here, and then we'll go to our breakout groups with our commitments. I think these are really important, and I want to emphasize these. So first of all, equity, first and foremost. This is a project about improving access to opportunities and quality of service for our transit critical populations, low income populations, people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, or people who live in households with few or no vehicles. This is also a project focused on truly transformational change. So we think in order to really improve the experience for our bus riders, we need to look at the entire network and not just make kind of small tweaks to routes. We're also talking about a better network for the people who ride today. We spent a lot of time talking to our riders and hearing from them what they want, and we want to deliver that. We also are planning for extensive stakeholder engagement. This project really cannot be successful unless we hear from our riders and work with our municipal partners and other stakeholders to implement this. And we also are talking about implementation in the near term in phases starting 2022. And then finally, really integrating service changes with infrastructure and especially bus priority to provide the levels of service that we want to provide and maximize benefits to our riders. So with that, I think I want to quickly I see there's a lot of questions and comments coming in, which is wonderful. I love to see that. We are going to have a Q&A session after the breakout groups. So, we will plan to kind of go through these and come back to those. Also, I noticed that a few folks were asking and said they had to jump off of this a little bit earlier. There will be a recording of this entire presentation up on our website after this meeting is over. So just wanted to note those two things for folks. So Shayna, if you can go to the next slide, and we'll talk about the breakout sessions. So we're going to have small group discussions, and we're going to, Reagan is going to talk in a minute about how we're going to set those up. But essentially what we really want to focus on is just what you want to get out of this project. And so we'll be having those discussions. Just to note, there's no differences between the rooms with the exception of one of the rooms, which is we'll have Spanish interpretation. So Reagan, can you just provide instructions for how folks can join?
Sure, Caroline. So first, I do want to reiterate that we are looking at the chat, and we will be going through and addressing comments and questions during Q&A, but we're going to hold all questions until that time. All of the attendees will be able to select the breakout room that they wish to join, and we are going to be in discussion for 25 minutes. So I think our timing is going to be slightly different than what Caroline shared at the beginning of the presentation, which is great because it actually means we're going to have more time for Q&A at the end of the meeting. So I'm going to say that we're going to be in the breakout rooms until 7:05 tonight. So I imagine it'll take us some time to get into the rooms. You will be in the rooms by 6:40, and we will be leaving the rooms at 7:05 to come back to the main session. Can you go to the next slide, Shayna? So each breakout room will have an assigned group leader who will introduce him or herself and lead the discussion. The breakout room sessions may be recorded, but that would only be for note-taking purposes. They are not going to be part of the meeting recording that is going to be shared online, nor are they going to be part of the live stream that's happening right now. There are note takers in each room that will be taking detailed notes, and those will be incorporated into the final written meeting summary for the meeting. So for the technical how to use Zoom business, you can click breakout rooms in your meeting controls, and this will display the list of open breakout rooms. And then you will click join next to the room you wish to enter, and then confirm by clicking join again. If you're having trouble in the room or you end up in the wrong room, for example, if you end up in an English language room and you wanted the Spanish language room, you have a few options. You can always select a call for help option, and a staff member can come and provide assistance in the chat. I will note that in order to keep the breakout rooms relatively balanced in size, we're going to ask you to choose your room based on the first letter of your last name, unless you want to participate in the Spanish language room. So for example, breakout room 1 will be for letters A through B, 2 for C through D, 3 E through G, etc. Those letters will be listed on the breakout rooms. When you arrive in the room, we will wait a minute or two to begin the session, because it's possible we have a lot of people with C as their last name tonight, and we want to rebalance the room slightly. You may get shifted into another room in order to keep the numbers relatively even. And if that happens, it will be done randomly. So I'm going to invite everyone. Amanda, if you could open the rooms, I'm going to invite everyone to join their breakout rooms now. If you're having trouble joining in the room, so I hope they were very informative. I'm a little disappointed I couldn't join any of the rooms, and I hope there was some good discussion. We're going to move into the question and answer session. And I will note that while you were in the breakout rooms, we were able to look through the chat a little bit as well. So that's great. Before you start raising your hands and everything, I'm going to go through my spiel again about how Q&A works. So I'll review a few details about the process. So I'll just ask your patience for just a few more moments. Can you go to the next slide, Shayna? So when the time arrives, if you would like to share a comment or ask a question, you can use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to submit a typed question. And I know some of you have already found that, or comment. And we're going to alternate between reading questions and comments already submitted and recognizing those who want to pose a question verbally. We have a lot of people tonight, which is fabulous, but so I'll ask you to be brief so we can hear from as many people as possible. People who want to share a question or comment verbally can press the raise hand button. And for those of you who are on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing star and then the number 9. For attendees who speak Spanish, please raise your hand to provide your comments and questions verbally for the interpreters to hear, and they will translate your comments. When we recognize your name, you will be unmuted and you may speak. And after you share your comment, we will lower your hand and then you will be returned to the muted state. I know some of you already have their hands raised, but before we open the comment and question segment to the public, we would like to invite any elected officials in attendance or their staff to ask questions or make comments. You can use the raise hand feature so we can recognize and unmute you. So first, let me see if there are any elected officials or staff who would like to make comments at this time. All right, so I'm seeing Courtney Foster. Amanda, can you unmute Courtney?
Oh, I'm actually not an elected representative.
Okay.
I just
Sorry,
happened to raise
staff.
my hand at that time. Sorry.
Okay. So
I'll wait my turn.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. We don't know all the staff members always. So all right, so can I ask anyone who's not an elected official or a member of their staff to lower their hands for just a moment? And I'm seeing one more raised hand, but Paul, Amanda, can you come up with me, Paul? Are you an elected official?
Yes, I am a member of the Arlington School Committee and a town meeting member.
Welcome. Thank you for attending our meeting tonight. Would you like to share your comments or questions?
Two things. Historically, we've had a lot of trouble coordinating bus service with students. Our students ride the MBTA to go to our Arlington High School and our middle schools. And it's been troublesome trying to coordinate the bus.
Oh, I think you may have muted yourself. Paul, I think you're on mute.
Unmute. Okay, okay. Are we here?
Yes,
Good.
I can hear you now.
Yeah, so the schedule, we've had really miserable time. Our state rep has been involved. We haven't been able to get good coordination between the buses and our in our school arrival dismissals. The second thing is it's very concerning that we are about 6 months out from opening the Green Line extension, and there's been no discussion in this community about how bus service is going to connect us to the Green Line extension. The only thing that we've heard is that the 80 would be discontinued under the COVID shutdowns rather than improving that. And that needs to change. We need really good connections to develop habits of people using buses to get to the Green Line.
Great. Thank you for your comment, Paul. Appreciate it. I'm going to go to the chat for a minute because I know we had a lot of questions and comments prior to the breakouts. So let me move there. And I'm going to start from the very early in the meeting of Caroline. There was a question about the stats that you were sharing about whether or not they were, it was from Ann McKinnon, they were for all of Boston or the entire MBTA service area. It was from the very beginning of the presentation.
Yeah, and I just wanted to quickly address Paul's comment about GLX. So Paul, just so you know, we actually are rethinking the bus routes as part of Bus Network Redesign and thinking about GLX as part of this process. So I just wanted to mention that it is very much part of this project and thinking about how the bus can better connect to that new service that will be open. So just wanted to mention that. Reagan, in terms of the data, I don't actually fully remember. I'll have to go back and look at that. I think some of the data was specific to Boston and some might have included other municipalities.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caroline. I also know I want to acknowledge that I know some of the facilitators are also sharing some of the questions that came up during the breakout rooms too, so we will get to those as well. I wanted to bring up a comment from Abby Swain about the use of the term walking distance. Walking distance, she says, needs to be defined stringently for those in wheelchairs, i.e. manageable distances, sidewalks of firm, smooth texture, mild slope and adequate width, free from obstructions, compliant curb ramps in good condition, and pedestrian refuges and lane divider cuts of adequate geometry for crossing conditions, including signal wait times. So I just wanted to read that comment.
Yeah,
And,
actually, Reagan, I think like if Alyssa, I think it might be helpful if you talked a little bit about how we are thinking about walk distance in terms of how we measure it, but just if you want to say something on that. And I also, sorry, I realized that I wanted to emphasize on the GLX comment earlier, we are not suspending the 80. So I just wanted to be clear on that. So apologies for not mentioning that earlier. Alyssa?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as we mentioned a few times, people with disabilities is a big focus for us in thinking about equity and making sure our network is accessible. And so specifically the outreach that I mentioned that we'll be doing soon, we're targeting a lot of these sorts of communities where we really want to sort of get at what actually is sort of convenient for people for whom walking may be an issue, to make sure that when we are actually sort of like measuring our bus network, we can measure it for sort of a variety of different definitions of high quality service. And we are definitely sort of considering walking accessibility and all of that. And a big part of Bus Network Redesign is like partnering with the folks at the T who are working on bus stops, and sort of conversations with municipalities are a critical part of that. So like even when we're not sidewalk owners, we're going to be sort of talking to the people who do have some more control over what that area looks like. So yeah, we'll be incorporating a lot of those sorts of thoughts into the process.
thanks, Alyssa. While I have you here,
yes,
there are a few questions in the chat, both about travel demand and the LBS data. So let me keep you here for a moment and read some of them. So there is a question about how travel demand is being gauged for routes that were eliminated during the pandemic. And I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things. So our LBS data that I mentioned, the location-based services data, it takes into account all modes. So even if transit was suspended somewhere, we sort of know what travel in general looked like in any given particular area on other modes. So if people switch to walking or biking or driving, we sort of have a sense of there still being travel demand in particular areas. And also just in general, kind of because the pandemic has been a weird time for travel, we're still looking a lot at sort of pre-pandemic data. So a lot of what you'll be seeing in like the outreach tool, for example, is looking at fall 2019 before the pandemic, and sort of knowing that what was happening before the pandemic is not necessarily indicative of what will keep happening into the future as sort of people are readjusting and we're reopening. We've also sort of built all of our data systems to be really flexible so that as we reach a new normal, we can sort of recheck how travel patterns have changed. So it's something that we're really consistently monitoring.
Thank you.
And I would add to that, I think the LBS data, this is one of the really amazing things about this project, because if we were looking at only existing bus ridership, we'd be missing the trips that the current system isn't serving. And there's a lot of those. And we would also be missing cases where people are having to make very inconvenient trips. Like there's a lot of cross-down demand we've seen in the data that doesn't really show up in current ridership patterns. The current ridership patterns make you think everyone's headed downtown. When we look at the LBS data, we realize how many crosstown trips there are. So that's the purpose of using that data, is to really make a network that works even for the people who the current network doesn't work for.
Thanks, Christoph and Alyssa. Alyssa, one more sort of technical question is, how does the LBS data sort of distinguish, this is from Bruce, between bicycle, auto, transit, and walking?
Sure, yeah. So basically the company we purchased this data from, Streetlight, does a lot of analysis looking at sort of travel patterns. So there's a few things they look at. One really obvious one is speed, where some speeds make it more likely that you're in one particular mode or another. For example, if you're on a bike path or in a rail right of way, it's a lot more obvious what sort of mode you're on if there's only one mode that can be in a particular place. But in general, there's sort of a wide variety of those sorts of characteristics that they look at to try to make a best guess. So it's not 100% perfect for sure, and it's, but it's sort of the closest understanding we have of how people are traveling differently in different places.
Great, thank you, Alyssa. I'm going to do a few more chat questions before I get to the verbal, because I have quite the backlog here. So I will say another question, Caroline, that came through is, how are equity, access, and competitiveness weighted in decisions about service?
Oh, that's a good question. I think Alyssa, do you want to talk about that more too? I think that's like very much a work in progress in thinking about those things, but Alyssa, yeah.
Yeah, so I think something to be like super clear about is that for sort of network design that comes out, we're going to be reporting on all of those pieces separately, so that like both sort of decision makers within the T and also anyone in the public can really see sort of each individual piece in our metrics. How are we doing with those things? But really, we're sort of thinking about them all together. So when we're looking at access, we're specifically looking at sort of like, where are we providing competitive access? Where are we providing non-competitive access? And where are we providing like no access whatsoever? So really looking at sort of where are there high quality connections and where they're not. And specifically for the equity pieces, every single sort of number that you'll see reported about the network as far as these like competitive access questions go, we'll have a breakdown for equity for low-income people and people of color, particularly, and then sort of looking at sort of different definitions of what makes high quality service at all. For example, for seniors or other folks for whom like walking distance may be more of an issue. So all of that information will be provided to sort of allow for transparent decision making to happen.
Thanks. Actually, Sheena, I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide for one real quick, because I do want to emphasize, I'm going to keep this slide on screen because it shows the website, and I know Amanda will probably put the links in the chat as well. the Bus Network Redesign website. I know we've made reference tonight that the meeting recording will be posted there, as well as the presentation. Also, I'm going to do my best to be really efficient and go through as many comments and questions as I can, but we do have a lot. So I will emphasize that you can always email us. And if you put your comments in the chat, we will be saving the chat as well tonight, and that will be incorporated into the meeting summary. So just saying that for the record, but we're going to dive right back in for the questions again. So I think there's another specific question here about equity and centering it, a specific root question about the 55 bus, but I think Alyssa, you sort of already have treated that already, the equity question. So, but I think
the only thing about the 55 bus, I will say, is it's good that they are restoring it for the summer, but the concern is that it's not sufficient, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. We'd like to see the 55 bus return to its initial schedule pre-pandemic, where it ran till like 11 o'clock at night and it served downtown Boston during the day. That's what we'd like to see. And I don't know if there's been any update, but maybe it might be. I was told that this was for the summer season, but they may reconsider reverting to the original schedule for the fall. That's to be considered. So I don't know if that's true, but that's what I had heard.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Okay, so I'm going to stick to the chat questions, and I will just ask folks to remain muted so that we are able to answer questions and take them in order as well. So there were some questions about, there was a comment, I'll just note that advocating for getting late night service back again, and how it's critical for third shift workers. So I'm sharing that. Question about how improving staffing affects reliability. I'm thinking this is due to operator staffing. And Lisa here is talking about trips getting dropped due to sick days, planned vacations, etc.
Yeah, Melissa or Kat, would you want to answer that question?
Sure. Oh, let's take it.
Certainly, if I miss anything, feel free to chime in, Kat. But in general, with any of the networks that we provide, we want to make sure that we're able to operate them reliably. So making sure that our staffing levels are appropriate for the amount of service that we're scheduling, making sure that we have an appropriate, what we call a cover list. So that's sort of a set of extra operators that aren't assigned regular work, but that they're the folks who fill in should someone be on sick leave or unavailable to work for whatever reason. So I absolutely agree that's important, and we would need to consider that as part of any of the network changes that we're considering.
The only thing I'd add to that too is coming out of the pandemic, one thing the T did recently commit to is we're adding, I think, another 60 bus operators in the coming months, and that's specifically to improve reliability over the coming months. So it's absolutely a key part of any better bus project.
Thanks, Kat and Melissa. I'm trying to keep folks who are answering questions sort of spotlighted in the Zoom. So I do want to, we do have a verbal comment here. Brenda has her hand raised. So Amanda, can you unmute Brenda?
Brenda, you be able to unmute yourself?
Okay.
Hi,
Am
Brenda.
I unmuted?
You're
Hi.
fine. We can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. I'm just concerned very much, excuse me, about the 55 bus. I live in that area and I use a wheelchair, and it's very important to me to feel safe when I am riding the bus or any bus. And I really would like to see it up and running. And as the gentleman said before me, back to the times that it was running before the pandemic. it's like the only bus over here, and the Green Line is not. I mean, they're working on that. We need to be able to travel to the places we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will note that there are several comments about the 55 in the chat that we will include in the meeting summary and make sure that we will recognize. I'm going to sort of switch back to some of the questions our facilitators have raised. I know in one of the breakout rooms, it was the same staffing level question. There is a question that came from one of the rooms about how this project sort of intersects with commuter rail, and I'm guessing other sort of modes. Caroline, I don't know if that's something you can address.
I'm sorry, Reagan, can you repeat?
Sure.
I was noticing for folks that we are close to we are past 7:30. So I think staff are prepared to stick around for another 10 minutes, just so everyone knows. And then we'll wrap up at 7:40.
Wonderful.
So, sorry, was distracted.
No worries. And I know Alyssa's trying to answer some questions also in the chat as well. So I think we'll need about 5 minutes to wrap up. So I think probably about 9 more minutes of questions, Caroline, then 5 minutes to do the wrap up. So the question came from one of the breakout rooms, is how does this project, the planning, coordinate with other modes like commuter rail?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think we're in a really good position with bus because it's our most flexible mode. It can adjust really easily and adapt. And I think as some folks may be aware, there's a lot of other kind of bigger projects going on at the T, including rail transformation, Green Line transformation. And it's been great because we've had a lot of really good kind of internal discussions about how we can best coordinate on those efforts. So I think there's certainly internally a lot of coordination happening, though I can't say anything like concrete at this moment, but we're certainly exploring ways that we can really think about the network as a whole and not just bus, but really think about the entire MBTA network and how bus can complement our other services.
Thank you. I'm going to try to group some of the chat comments into some overarching questions, and this is more about municipal coordination. So one of the questions is about specifically about how is the MBTA working with Boston on this, but another one was sort of along the lines of, if the municipality is not supportive of a policy like a bus only lane, what does that mean for the project? So I don't know if I've kind of smushed a few comments together, but I don't know if folks want to answer that.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to talk about this. And then if Kat or Melissa want to say more on our kind of approach with municipal partnerships, as Melissa talked about during the presentation, municipal partnerships are absolutely critical to the success of the bus network redesign, not just to get buses through traffic, which is like super important, but also for all of the other things that folks on this meeting brought up today, improving bus stop amenities, improving sidewalk access and other things, including layover and our facilities. So I think the way that we're kind of approaching this is we plan to really work closely with our municipal partners to think through where we can get transit priority and how to, again, like speed up buses through traffic. And I think the reality is, like, we can keep kind of like adding buses to congested corridors, but it's not really going to achieve the levels of service that we're trying to achieve here. And so I think that's where it kind of like merits some further discussion with our municipal partners to really figure out how we can achieve the levels of frequency that we know that people want. I don't know, Kat or Melissa, if you want to say anything further on the municipal partnerships piece.
I think you covered it. I think it's a really, really important element. I know we have many of our municipal partners on the call tonight, and we appreciate their continued collaboration. I think it's a fair question. I think the two things I would just add, just to highlight, and I can steal Christoph's words, he's used them so well, is that slide was not code for financial partnerships. That was not code for anything, but it really means that we do need to work collaboratively together, and that often layover spaces are just as important sometimes as transit signals priority. And it's really, as long as we're taking that collaborative approach and thinking through like we have been, but it's really, I think if there's a couple cases, and the reason I think Caroline said that we're looking at a multi-phased approach, that if we're looking at some really new high frequency corridor bus routes and we'd be putting them in congested corridors, the reason we're proposed doing a phased approach is that there's some things we can hopefully do, right away in 2022, but there are other things that might take a couple of years to be able to essentially set the bus route up for success, to make sure the bus riders are having a fast and frequent experience. So every route's going to be a little different, and we know our municipal partners, and we're going to have to talk through each one a little differently too. But it's going to be an ongoing conversation. But it's important to realize that the physical space is just as important as the design of the routes.
Thanks, Kat. I will note that there's a lot of great suggestions in the chat for specific route improvements that we will be collating and putting together. I will say there are a few still lingering questions that I'm going to try to get to as well. There is a question about the taxpayer funding of MassDOT and the MBTA annually, and I don't know if anyone has that data of the budget information. And that's Herman, and his other question is about how the MBTA, I guess, allocates money and maintenance and time on different buses in the fleet. Like his suggestion is that the Silver Line and the 28 bus gets more attention than other buses in the fleet. So don't know if anyone has the budget answer or the maintenance question.
I guess with the maintenance is driven much like your car based on the mileage. So all of our maintenance schedules and the amount we'd invest is going to be based on the mileage and then the age of the fleet. And the MBTA, we haven't covered this tonight, but Caroline addressed it. The MBTA does have about a 15-20 year plan to replace our entire bus fleet and move them to zero emissions. So there is no sort of trade-off between where we invest. It's entirely driven by age of the fleet and the overall mileage of the fleet.
And does anyone have the budget numbers? Maybe not on us. Okay, so I would suggest that if you want to email us that question, we can get you the accurate and most up-to-date numbers and respond to you with that. I do want to jump back to some of the questions from the breakout sessions. I'm sorry, I'm bopping all over the place a little bit. There is a question a little bit about how school trips and service is going to be taken account into the design, and I've seen some of that referenced in the chat as well. So I wanted to be sure we got to that question.
Yeah, I think Alyssa talked about this a little bit earlier. What's great about this new data set that we have is that it captures all trips. And one of the most interesting findings, I think, is seeing those non-work trips. So like school trips, middle of the day trips, evening trips, weekend trips. And I think that that's something that we're looking closely at as part of this project. And then as well with the survey that we're about to put out soon, that'll be another kind of piece that people can talk to.
Great. I am trying to get to as many of these questions as I can, but I will reiterate to please also email us if your question was not answered tonight, or you have additional comment that you haven't already shared in the chat or in the breakout sessions, because we do want to capture this. Caroline mentioned that everyone's feedback is so important to this project. And we're so excited that so many people came tonight. But it is challenging. So there is another question I do want to, and there's, because it's come up a few times, and I think this might be the last one, Caroline, before I let you finish up the presentation, which is both about how the pandemic and COVID have affected both like the rest. I think this came up in some of the sessions as well, the restoration of service, as well as, you know, what does it mean in terms of the cost of this project? And there's another question about like concerns about a second wave possibly happening again, which makes me, I almost don't even want to say it out loud.
Yeah, let's just not. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question to ask. Like, we are obviously in this virtual world right now. I'm not sure if folks remember, we were like one of those meetings that got canceled right before the world kind of shut down. So it's certainly like an important question to acknowledge. So I think there's a few things with that. And then I guess if Kat or Melissa want to say anything about some of the shorter term changes, I can talk about like how we're viewing things in the longer term, or not longer term, but in like a year plus for Bus Network Redesign. So I think as I was kind of talking about earlier, like one thing that we knew before the pandemic was, again, a lot of off-peak trips that were happening that we were not serving well. I think the pandemic really underscored those trips, especially for our essential workers. And so I think that that's something that's just, again, kind of been emphasized throughout. I think, again, just we've seen that bus has had much more ridership compared to our other modes. So again, just kind of like emphasizing the importance of focusing on it. And then I guess for what we're planning for, I think Alyssa talked about this in her slide, but we are planning for like pre-pandemic levels of service hours with the intention that we will identify where we would want to have additional service if there was additional funding. I don't know, Christoph, if you want to say anything about this specifically, but I know, like, for example, in Houston and in Austin, they did the same thing where they had kind of a resource neutral exercise, but because of like doing this type of holistic network redesign, they were able to make the case to get an additional 5 to 8% more. So I think that is kind of our approach there.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this project is making the case for the bus. We're really seeing what we think is possible with a better bus network, what trips bus could serve that it isn't serving today. And we will absolutely be looking for those opportunities of, if we did have more resources, where could we put those additional resources? I will note that is another thing where partnerships matter. If we are going to have a bigger fleet, that does mean we need more bus garages, which means we need to build more bus garages, which means we need to have the good places to build them. So this is also that point where all of these different initiatives touch each other. And again, if we can get bus lanes on the ground, the bus can make that trip faster. That's actually the equivalent of adding to the fleet. Since that means we can use a smaller number of buses to provide the same service, and then put those buses on other routes to add service there. So the more we get bus priority, the better all of this looks as well.
Thanks, Christoph. And Melissa, I don't know if you want to say anything about the shorter term changes and how pandemics affected those. And then Shana, when you get a chance, as Melissa's talking, I think it would make sense to go to our next slide, which highlights some upcoming meetings that Melissa, I believe, will be presenting at this week.
Yeah, let me flag that we have a meeting scheduled for Thursday, this Thursday, 6 p.m. to talk about the summer schedule changes. And there's another meeting to be scheduled sometime in July or August to talk about fall schedule changes. I know there had been some discussion about the 55 and some other things that are slated for the summer. And we're expecting more return to work for like commuter oriented routes. So that's the general push for some of the fall service restorations. We have whole meetings scheduled, so I won't get into all the details on those changes, but we do have these other processes in place to have those conversations.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And I do want to note, I know we got a ton of comments in here, like route specific comments. So I think those are the type of comments that are going to be discussed more Thursday's meeting and the other meetings coming up on the fall service changes. So just wanted to flag that for folks. I think because it is now 7:45, time really flies when you're talking about the bus network. I'm going to wrap up. So Melissa already kind of talked through this slide. So I did just want to emphasize again, there's a lot of other events going on this summer and ways to get involved. We, in addition to the service change meetings coming up, we are also planning to have the Better Bus Project open house that we weren't able to have before the pandemic happened. So we're really excited about that as an opportunity to bring all of the initiatives together. And so we haven't determined a date for that, but that'll be sometime in August. And then noted here, and I know Alyssa and other folks are really involved with this, the MBTA's customer opinion panel is another really great way to provide input to the T. So just wanted to highlight that here as well. Next slide. So thank you, everyone. This has been a great discussion, and we really appreciate kind of how active and how engaged everyone was throughout the meeting in this heat, nonetheless. But at least in my breakout group, everyone was drinking a lot of water, so I feel good about that. But really do appreciate everyone attending this meeting tonight and all of your comments. And as Reagan said, everything in the chat will be saved and sent to the kind of appropriate parties. And you can continue the discussion with us either by looking on our website, seeing future events, or emailing us here. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening.